Friends, welcome back to Cultural Savage. Today I am talking with my dear friend, Brandon Johnson. Brandon has a Master of Arts in Marriage, Couple, and Family Counseling from George Fox University and is a private therapist, has a private practice in Oregon City, Oregon. He's also the Director of Client Services at Family SkillBuilders. He also holds a Master of Divinity from Western Seminary and has spent the last 5 years as a member of an intentional Christian community and church based in Portland called Springwater Community. Brandon, thank you so much for joining me this evening. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. So you and I have known each other a long ass time, just straight up.
It's been over 10 years.
Easy.
Yeah.
I don't even know how long, but for those that don't know you, why don't you tell us a little bit of your story, just who you are, your history, how you got here to where you are today, the easy stuff.
Yeah, just a quick answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm a therapist and work in social services, social work realm, which just took me a long time to get there. When you and I were first starting to get to know each other, I was thinking I was going to be a pastor, leading churches, and had just started seminary, and I'm not doing that. So, which I honestly, I think part of how I got to not doing that was conversations with you, in the best way.
I will take that as a compliment this time.
Yeah. There was, I think part of, it's always been a desire to help people grow as people, whether it was in a church context or now as a therapist. And it's been a really long, kind of circuitous route to figure out the best way for me to do that. Mm-hmm. Exploring monasticism and how to grow and being inspired by monks in conversations with you of kind of how to do that. And then looking towards intentional community as a way to form myself and trying to start one that failed miserably and painfully within less than a year. And then joining the community that we're with now, that has been really formative as well. I think even when we used to talk over drinks and stuff, we talked about how my kind of starting point in my theology and spirituality was thinking about anthropology, to use the systematic theology term for it, but essentially what makes humans human? And how does that intersect with making meaning and connecting with God?
Yeah, that's always been your starting point in our conversations. Have always been, you've always started with humanity, which is something that I've so appreciated about you, because I get really caught up in the divinity stuff, but you tend to ground me with the humanity, which is fantastic. It's a great foil to each other. It just really is. So you just said something about helping humans be human. Can you expand on that a little bit? How
much time do we have?
We got as much time as Zoom will allow. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think I might have struggled with how to say that well a few years ago. Even if we're thinking in spiritual and theology terms, it even is reminiscent of Augustine kind of stuff of you're not fully human until you've been revived by the Holy Spirit and our new which is not what I mean. So, but I think I have better language for it now, honestly, after having gone through my master's counseling and really dug into how we function, even crazy fields like interpersonal neurobiology, that have really helped me understand how we are just wired from the ground up for connection. And like, we tend to think of ourselves as like a solid entity, like a solid, like I am me, and that's a static thing.
Right.
And that static thing manages to somehow find connections with other static things that just are like sort of loosely connected. But I don't think that's real. I think who we are as a person, our sense of self, is it's not a thing, it's an action, and it's constantly being active. We're constantly being ourselves actively and becoming ourselves, and that really can only happen in relationships.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think even to the extent of like, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a conversation like where there's literally another person in a room, but we constantly like internalize other people. Like I don't really know you separate from how I have filtered you through my experiences.
Right.
And I have like this image of you in my mind that I interact with that's being built on right now, even, like,
Right.
but,
Right.
And so even if we're apart, like that image of you in my mind is part of how I am forming my understanding of everything. It's one piece of it.
So are you talking like the image of Brandon that I have in my mind is forming me because of the memories that I have, or because of the way that I think you understand me, or because of how I react to the image that I have of you?
All of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the to start with the first one, the memories you have, like, I think even talking about what our memory is a little, just a piece. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but is like we tend to think of it like a video where there are pictures and like sound files that are just like stored. But really, what it is memories recreate the active neural pathways that were activated in the original experience.
Right. We create our memories as we remember them.
Right. And how we understand at least what we think another person is experiencing and communicating is by mirroring in our own brains what's happening in their brains, or what we think is happening anyway on an unconscious level, doing our best, which is only our best, not perfect, but
is there a perfect?
So yeah. No, never.
Right.
Yeah. But so what I'm getting at is like your first example of what it could be of memory is, yes, is informed by and continues to inform what you think is happening in my mind, which includes what you think I think of you.
Okay.
And particularly how I affect you, whether it's what I think of you or if I'm a help or a threat to you in some way as you're interpreting me in that, would prompt your emotional reaction to me. Which it gets towards like the kind of the very fundamental piece of what I think of as spirituality and what it means to be human, of essentially survival, and the kind of everything we do is geared toward self-preservation.
Right, because we want ourselves to flourish.
Right. And unfortunately, many, maybe most of our like instinctive ways to do that end up causing more problems.
Now, do you think that's because it's instinctual in us, like, let's call it a sin nature? Or do you think that's because of what behaviors we have learned from little t traumas?
Probably more the latter. I think rather than sin in general, maybe you might equate, if you're wanting to use a biblical word for it, you might be able to equate it with flesh.
Okay.
It's the part of us that's just like survival at all costs. And
now, okay, let me ask this about that. I know we're kind of jumping a little bit, but I think this is important. Survival at all costs. Is that survival of us as a static creature or survival of us as a fluid creature?
Well, I think we are fluid creatures, like I was saying before. So regardless of how we see ourselves, I think that's what's happening for us.
So it's the survival sense of the action of my being versus the survival sense of I need to stay as I am now.
Right. Which changing in some unknown way might feel like a threat to our survival as a being, as rather than, so change still feels threatening just because you don't necessarily know where it's leading until you get there. But yeah, I think that survival instinct, that self-preservation, really is at the heart of what we call sin, of that flesh of, like, you feel it in your body. That's where it starts, right? It's your brain is supposed to keep you alive. Your body is supposed to keep you alive. That's what it does, and it's just not always very smart. Which is where the relationships come in to help you learn better ways. Yeah.
Now, is it really that survival instinct isn't very smart, or is it that survival instinct is more myopic?
Yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. I think it's short-sighted is really what it is. It's wanting to help me survive in this very moment.
So it's moment to moment rather than looking at like the long game of like, what does it mean to thrive versus what does it mean to survive in this moment?
Right. And it's not really asking a lot of deep questions. It's mostly just, how can I have an experience in this moment that's as far away from anything reminiscent of death as I can get?
Let's just stay far away from that. Okay. So this brings us up to a spirituality point. We're supposed to stay, our brains and our bodies are instinctually telling us we're supposed to stay as far away from death as possible. But the Christian spirituality tells us that the death of self leads to resurrection.
Yeah.
So how do we harmonize those two?
Well, I think that's the thing, is one of the primary ways that we can stop or manage, because there's that flesh, that self-preservation instinct isn't bad in and of itself, right? It causes problems when it's the only voice at the table. So it should have an input because survival is important.
Right, because otherwise, how are you going to flourish if you don't actually survive?
Right, but it can't be the only thing in charge of making decisions. Otherwise, other things like healthy choices and relationships and long-term goals and spirituality, honestly, get left by the wayside. So the kind of the death to self, that cruciformity that you're referencing there, like, that's really the antidote of, instead of having our behaviors and thoughts and emotions and choices all being dictated by this absolute fear of death, being a slave to sin, if you will. We can learn to trust that things are going to be okay. Learn to trust, have faith in God, in life, that, you know what, there might be things that are more important than just not dying. And learning to accept death as part of life, even if it's, you know, whether it's the absolute, like, my obituary is going to be in the paper in a couple of days, or just like, I have to, even something as simple as like, I'm going to have to go another 10 minutes of feeling hungry.
Right.
Which is going to make me super cranky because my flesh is saying, you're dying.
Right.
So, like, if we can learn to discipline by building on that trust, it's a really important voice at the table, you know.
Okay, so that voice at the table of trust, you said about trusting God. What about trusting other people?
Yeah. That's a tricky thing, isn't it?
Just a little bit, yeah.
It's, I mean, I guess depending on who you are, it either sounds really nice or really stupid. So you trusting people, absolutely, like trusting people how? Like trusting them to always do things in your best interest, trusting them to be there when you need it, like probably either of those things or anything isn't going to be, like, assuming that that's going to be true about someone is never going to lead you in the right direction. And that's going to be true the other way too. Assuming that someone's going to always hurt you is
So,
not going to do you well either.
Oh, okay. Let's back up for just a minute. If in the Christian lens of spirituality, we're called to the death of self.
Are we?
Well, and you're not supposed to ask me questions. I'm supposed to ask you questions.
Yeah, I mean, you taught me about asking the right questions, right?
Oh, geez. Yeah. I think we are because of the kenosis, because of the self-emptying of Christ. He emptied himself of the desire to be godlike, of that power.
Yeah. That prerogative to hold the divine power. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we empty ourselves of the prerogative of holding divine power. We empty ourselves of the struggle to hold power. That is a death to self, because ultimately that flesh you were talking about wants to be in control of everything so that we don't die.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is what you're saying, that is, though, that for God, for Christ, that's an actual choice of something real.
Yeah.
For us, that's not so much a choice of something real as or at least of whether or not we're gonna give it up or not, give up control over our own fate. We don't have that control. So for us, it's a choice of whether or not we're going to accept the truth of that reality. Are we going to accept that we cannot control what's going to happen to us in 10 minutes, let alone in 10 years? And find peace in that acceptance of stopping that constant battle against reality that we're waging in our own minds. Or are we going to try at all costs to maintain that illusory control that never can be attained? And it's only leads to more pain.
I And I think this is where the idea of the death of self really comes in, because giving up that control is giving up the possibility, is giving in, I should say, to the possibility that you could die.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Well, we will.
Well,
I
yeah,
will.
yeah. I mean, we will, but I'm talking just moment by moment. You know, that survival instinct we have that says moment by moment, how the hell do I keep myself alive?
Mm-hmm.
Is now saying it's now accepting that I may not be able to keep myself alive. And that's a death. That's a grief.
Yes, absolutely. It's a loss, it's grief, it's experienced by your brain that is both incredibly sophisticated and also super simple in some ways.
Yeah.
As like, this feels like I'm dying right now.
Yeah.
Like, and that, I think that's part of the curse of being human, right? Like, as far as we know, which, you know, maybe we're not right, but as far as we know, we're the only creatures that can do that sort of self-contemplation. So like, cortisol is a stress hormone in the body that I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to interrupt. My daughter is out of bed and coming to talk to me, even though she was instructed to go find her mom if she needed something. Not feeling well, I guess. So, understandable.
No.
Yeah. I mean, there's a good example of, survival instinct overriding the part of you that wants to be obedient to the instructions you've been given, right?
Right.
The different parts of your brain taking over. Like, I feel like I'm dying, even if it's just a little bit. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
We really do try to worm our way out of discomfort.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, as far as our like lower brain, that reptilian brain is concerned, discomfort equals death.
Yeah.
And so we're just like, dude, why are you acting like that? Because it's not that big a deal. Like, yeah, if you're in this more like calm, rational place, sure, you can reason yourself out of that. But if you're not, like, death, you're dying. Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's something to that. Like the idea, okay, so growing up in evangelical churchdom, the idea of dying to self was always this idea of like spiritually making it so that I wasn't important.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're the very image of God. You're worth everything.
Right, so if someone is worth everything, okay, if someone is worth everything, why would the idea of death to self be so important?
First and foremost, because it benefits you.
How so?
Or me. I'm going to borrow something from Buddhism, if that's allowed.
Yes, because we have so many strict rules here.
Right.
You're not allowed to do any of that shit.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to disclaimer here, I'm not nearly educated enough on Buddhism to really represent it well. But I've encountered this idea in life. The idea of what is referred to as the two arrows. So you're out and about minding your own damn business, and some jerk out there decides to do some target practice and shoots you in the leg with an arrow.
Okay.
Shit, that hurts. There's an arrow in my leg. What the hell? That's painful.
Right.
Okay. So in this teaching, that first arrow just represents like the pain of being hit by an arrow. And that's just a fact. Life has pain in it, experiences have pain in it, and there's nothing you can do about that.
Right.
But we can choose to be okay with that. Like, not okay with that as in we like don't try to get it out. Like, yeah, try to solve the problem or whatever, but accept that that's the reality. There's an arrow in my leg and it hurts a lot. But in this teaching, not only do we experience the physical pain of an arrow in my leg, I also, most of us experience this like, shit, I don't want to feel an arrow in my leg. Why is there an arrow in my leg? I hate this arrow in my leg. It hurts and I don't want it to hurt. God damn it, stop hurting. And that like just on so many levels increases the awfulness of the experience. I have this like emotional anguish about it. I'm probably physically tensing my leg muscles, which is just making it worse. Because I'm so upset about it. I'm probably, even once the arrow is gone and I'm bandaged up and the pain starts to lessen, I'm still going to probably be mad about it. Like it just increases the suffering of this experience so much. And so this dying to self, I think what that really is trying to get at is this acceptance that I'm not in control of whether or not my life goes according to plan, whether or not I'm comfortable, whether or not I even experience truly horrific events. Like these events, these are not, I'm not just trying to downplay it like, oh yeah, first world problems. Like maybe you were in a car accident and horribly injured. Maybe someone that you loved died. Maybe you were raped. Maybe your home burned down. Like these are like, this is not an easy thing to apply in little circumstances, let alone huge comprehensive circumstances, you know. But it's still real. If we can die to ourself, die to the expectation that I can keep myself from having bad things happen to me and getting upset when that illusion proves to be an illusion, then I've removed half of the problem. I've removed that mental anguish, that suffering, that resistance, and only have to deal with the reality of just the pain of what's actually happening.
Right. Because the other thing that Buddhism teaches is that goes parallel with this is the idea of suffering. Suffering is holding on to pain because you're trying to change it.
Right. Yeah, that resistance is half the problem.
Right. I don't want this arrow in my fucking leg. But if you just sort of accept that, no, there's an arrow in my leg, now what do I do?
Yeah. And it hurts like a motherfucker. And I'd rather that not be happening, but that is what's happening. So
yeah.
I
think that's where Christians miss the idea, though. They miss the idea of the death to self because their idea of the death to self is some magnanimous martyrdom. Like, I'm going to die to myself and only want what God wants. Look at me. Thank God I'm not like this tax collector.
Yeah, and I think that's connected with some really bad theology about having to earn grace. I was actually yeah. Well, when I first started that sentence, I was going to say God's favor, but then I remembered from all my seminary training and stuff that the words being translated as grace is actually the same word that in other places is translated as favor.
Right. So having to earn God's unmerited favor.
Right. Which Man, that sounds like a hamster wheel task if I've ever heard of one.
But it's
um,
true though,
yeah.
because the idea of grace in a lot of Christians' minds is the idea of morally zero. Like, you've zeroed out my points, so now I need to keep it at zero.
Yeah, and that brings me to like one of the things that I think of regularly that's like a really grounding part of how I see faith, spirituality, being a person is
Mm-hmm.
that grace, and I use that word with you, I might not with someone who doesn't share the same tradition.
Sure.
Um, but grace really has nothing to do with what's earned or deserved or merited.
No, it
Um,
doesn't.
yeah, I was taught the specific like mnemonic device growing up in evangelical church of mercy is not getting what you deserve,
Mm-hmm.
and grace is getting what you don't deserve. Bullshit.
It's a fucking Newsboys song.
Yeah, bullshit. That was like a phrase literally said from the pulpit in my church.
Yeah.
And grace, on truly, fully, biblically, is throwing the question of what's deserved out the window.
Yes.
That is not part of the conversation.
No. It's really not, because this is that book that I talk about a lot, Between Noon and Three, by Robert Farr Capone.
Mm-hmm.
He sets up this idea of grace as paradigm shattering. It doesn't just change the question, it changes the whole way of even asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not a matter of getting what you don't deserve, like God's kind of winking at you, being like, hey, this is a secret between us. Rather, it's this thing of God saying, I don't care what the fuck you do. This is who I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the starting point, right? This is who
Yeah.
I am. This is who you are. The details will come later, but that's what matters.
Okay. So I'm going to get a touch vulnerable here because I never do that.
I don't know if I can handle that.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I was talking with my therapist this week, and we got into the idea that I believe in Christian spirituality. And she said, basically, that intergenerational trauma is one of the systems of the world that we are not to conform to. Like it talks about in Romans, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So she basically said, like, intergenerational trauma is one of the systems of this world that we are not supposed to conform to, but we are supposed to be transformed by the truth of who, in this case, she's talking to me, of who I am versus who the trauma tells me I am. What do you think? What do you think about that?
My first thought is to ask you a very therapist-y question.
That's fair.
What happened for you when she said that?
I didn't like it because
Why not?
Because the shit that happened in my life, I still have a hard time calling trauma because it's normal to me.
And trauma speaks as something that's not normal.
Right. Trauma's like I got in a plane crash. Trauma's like something out of the ordinary happened to me. But for me, my mom's death when I was 2, the way my dad was and wasn't around, those things, they're normative to me because it's what I grew up with. So it's really hard to label it, even little t trauma. It's really hard to label it as trauma.
Mm-hmm. What would it mean for you if it were trauma?
It would mean that it wasn't my fault. And that's where the death to self really hits me. Because I want to be in control of my own story. Like, I want to be the person that says, it's my fault people leave. It's my fault I'm a fuck up. It's my fault, insert whatever it is. But I'm still in control of my story. Because if I'm in control of it, I don't have to die.
Right. Yeah.
And
if you were the one causing all of that, then you don't have to worry about other factors, other people having that much power in your life.
Exactly. This is why I get into the whole spirituality of being human. Because to me, humanity means something sacred. And it means something inherent in everyone. It's something that I inherently have, but I have a hard time making it personal and not generic. I have a hard time saying I am human versus we are human. So if the spirituality of being human is important, it has to be important on an individual level for everyone, or it's bullshit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be really hard for different reasons for each person to internalize and to attribute to others too.
Yeah. Oh, completely.
Yeah.
In my interviews so far, we haven't even gotten into like the idea that someone else is sacred to you because they're human. Like that idea resonates with me so much, but it's also so hard to get to because we can't get to the point of saying that I am sacred to myself.
Right. Which makes me think of love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. Which, taken as love your neighbor as much as yourself, is radical enough, I think.
Right.
In both directions. For some people, it's easier to love self than others. So for some, it's easier to love others more than self.
Right.
And I think in a really spiritually true way, biblically true way, humanly true way, we are each other to a large extent. There's a lot of overlap. Like you personally, Aaron, have formed a huge chunk of who I am as Brandon. And so has my wife, Chrissy, and other people in my life. And vice versa. Like I know that I have had influence on other people too, whether I like it or not. Like maybe it's not even all positive, like,
right.
Every interaction I have with another person forms their experience, which is part of what makes them who they are, because self isn't static, right? It's being built and created in every moment.
Right, because it's being experienced. It's like a living memory.
Yeah. Which is, I think, how we die. Like our brain stops creating the self. It stops being active.
So the death to self is when something in us stops trying to create ourself and starts accepting us for who we are.
Yeah, I think acceptance is a core component of it. And it's a lot more Buddhist or mindfulness language. But one of the things that I have really been exploring lately is how much of the truth of being human and spirituality that I'm more comfortable in now, and the language that I use now that I've gained from other sources of whether it be science or psychology or Buddhism or pop culture or whatever it is.
Right.
That feels more okay to use than evangelical Christianity that I grew up in.
Right.
How much those actually overlap way more than I originally knew.
Say more about that.
So acceptance is a good example of that. I think that's a big word that's kind of come into the culture through mindfulness practices, which were taken from Buddhism.
Right.
And how much what's actually being described as acceptance, where it's not approval, it's not endorsement, it's just acknowledging the truth. It's really embracing the truth, right?
Right.
And truth is something that we can totally get on board with as biblically grounded Christians,
Well, mostly.
At least the goal, right? At least the goal of embracing truth.
Yeah, the goal of embracing truth versus
we're comfortable with that language.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you that. We're comfortable with that language. We're just not comfortable with the idea of actual truth. We're comfortable with the idea of our truth.
Sure. Yeah. Being Christians doesn't mean anything about whether or not we have succeeded in these goals, but the language of talking about the word truth versus the word acceptance, we're much more comfortable with that. Another word that has come to mind, and that is contentment. And I don't know how much that's actually, it probably comes up in the Bible a little bit, but it's not actually in there a lot, I don't think, but it is surely a huge piece of my evangelical upbringing, striving for contentment.
Well, because Paul was content in all things.
Sure.
And, right. And Paul is the Superman that we all need to be.
Yeah, and Paul was a mystic, damn it. Paul has gotten a bad rep. And it's not his fault. It's Calvin's fault. If I'm going to point fingers, it's Augustine's fault.
It is, though.
Paul
was a mystic.
Medieval and Reformation and American theologian people's faults that Paul has been distorted and given a bad rap. But so contentment then. He was shipwrecked and jailed and bitten by a poisonous snake and starved half to death and all these things. And he was able to be okay with that and continue to keep the values that he had in mind. If I'm going to use more biblical language, is he kept his faith in Christ and the joy of the Lord. Right? So I'm going to give it more psychological Buddhist language of he was able to accept all of that as the reality is, and it kept him from suffering.
Wow. That's some shit right there. Because to keep yourself from suffering, to learn to keep yourself from suffering, that's got some weight behind it. That's like a full-on SWAT team to my mental capacity. Like, you're telling me, and everybody that's listening, I really want us to hear this. There is a way for us to learn. Whether we get it perfect every time or not isn't the point. But there is a way for us to learn to not suffer, even though we experience pain.
Yeah.
Wow. That's not just therapy talk either. That's like you just pulled it out of like, here's Romans in your face, fucker. Like, seriously. So if we're not supposed to suffer, because if we can learn not to, there's something inherently in that tells us we're not made to. So if we're not made to suffer, what is humanity made to do in a hard life?
In a word, this is gonna sound hokey as fuck. Love, honestly.
Okay, explain that. Give us more than just a word. Explain that.
I'm gonna try to be careful and protect being ethical as a therapist here and not saying too much about clients. But
Yes.
I have an example from my work. I have somebody who feels deeply disconnected from many people in their lives, particularly their parents. And they're young, they're college age.
Okay, other than the college age thing, you're talking about me so far, so you can just talk about me. It's okay.
Yeah. And I've only been working with this person for a couple of months, so and my style is not to do a lot of prescriptive, like, well, think about it like this instead. Like,
right.
I do a lot of asking questions and reflecting what I think I'm hearing. Maybe putting it in different words in a particular way on purpose.
Right.
And after maybe 6 sessions, so not that much, where I was almost wondering, like, man, am I just reflecting this person's opinion of their parents back to them too much? I'm like, am I serving to increase that distance by reinforcing the villainization of their parents is the problem, like,
right.
Kind of having almost like am I doing the right thing as a therapist kind of self-doubt. But then, like, 8th session, this person tells me that they've been able to have a conversation with their dad that was different than they had had before, that felt like connection, that felt healing. And paired with that was this person asking, what if part of the problem this whole time has been that my dad experiences the same kinds of things inside, but just doesn't show it, that I've been experiencing this whole time? These emotions of self-doubt, of self-deprecation, of not feeling good enough, of feeling rejected, feeling like if they put themselves out there, it's just going to be slammed back in their face. Which totally validated all of the theories that I've been taught in school and the books I've read, but I got to see it in action of, as soon as this person is treated with what Carl Rogers would have called unconditional positive regard, and what I would call, and what I think Jesus would call, love. They get as soon as this person gets treated fully as a human being without any conditions on that treatment.
So with grace.
Then that self-preservation, that flesh instinct to just like, I'm going to avoid the bad feelings and do whatever it takes to avoid the bad feelings because they mean death, gets calmed and assuaged. You feel safe, you feel secure, and then you start to be able to empathize with other people and pass on the love that you've received.
I did not ask for a therapy session when we did this.
That's truth for you, right? Like, what it means to be human.
Seriously.
Speaks to us at this level of what it means to be human. The details are different for all of us, drastically different. But these core ideas of love and connection, fear of death, these are true of all of us.
What's really interesting to me in this case study you just gave us, when the person learned to die to themselves by being loved, they felt safe.
Yeah, they didn't experience it as a death. They experienced it as a fuller life.
So maybe the whole Christian asceticism of like, I need to suffer to die is really just a bunch of self-medicating bullshit.
Yeah, it's a real distortion. Like, I have thought about that. Like, examples of saints standing off the shore of Ireland in ice cold water for hours every single day, and like, what the hell are you doing, brother? Like, why are you trying to like make yourself suffer? And connecting that with the more just day-to-day, more normal version of, well, maybe we're not going to be monks embracing asceticism so explicitly, but we're just going to like shame each other into feel like shit, and that'll be our version of suffering for Christ, right?
Or even taking it 1 degree further and saying, I need to suffer for Christ, so I'm going to invent a persecution complex of how my religious freedom is being impinged upon.
Right, because you're supposed to be different than the world, right? Like, so if I can just make sure that I'm defining the world as what those people are like,
right,
instead of what I'm like, then I'm good.
Maybe the way that we're supposed to be different from the world is by people who acknowledge the truth of love.
And the truth that prioritizing the good of those around you as something not necessarily even as more important than your own needs.
Right.
Although seeing others as more important than yourselves is a biblical phrase.
Yeah.
But just as fully valid, which I don't see in the actions, maybe in the words of the people that we're talking about. And I want to be careful because I keep putting others as the problem, even in my past few sentences here.
No, I understand though. And this is why last time we got together when we were having beers, and I said, love your neighbor as if you're loving yourself, and you called me on it. You're like, wait, you changed the wording. But this is why I changed that wording. Because if we're called to love each other as if we're loving ourselves, it speaks to that interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And people that don't love that way are responsible for their own suffering.
Yeah. And I think that comes.
I want to be really careful, though. I'm not trying to say that they're responsible for the bad shit that happens in their life.
No, absolutely not. I mean, maybe a few of the things if they made bad choices.
Right, but like I'm not responsible for my mom's death.
No.
It wasn't because I didn't have enough faith or because my dad didn't have enough faith or any bullshit like that.
No. Nothing that's about just like who you are wasn't good enough. So
right. But the idea of causing your own suffering, of hanging on to that pain.
Right. There's the difference between the pain and the suffering, right? Like
yes.
You didn't cause the pain of your mother's death.
Right.
You just didn't. You had nothing to do with it. And frankly, as a kid, like if you were really upset about it and had a lot of like anguish and like mental suffering about it, like yeah, you're supposed to. Like you shouldn't. There's no shame in that. There's no like, well, you weren't a spiritual enough, detached, selfless, enlightened being because you were able to say, well, what is, and my mom's dead, so okay.
I can't even say that now. Like it's been like 38 years and I still can't say that.
Yeah.
But
and I think
okay, go get your water. Yes, my child is interrupting as well. This is what children do.
That's a thing. That's a thing that they do. Yeah.
It is.
They have needs, and it's weird. I don't know why they would have needs.
But okay, so here's something that I just connected. For those of us that are parents, loving our neighbor as if we're loving ourselves is what we're doing when we're caring for our children.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, they are part of yourself.
Completely. I mean, what my therapist said about intergenerational trauma being a system of this world that we're not supposed to conform to. Intergenerational trauma is something that we pass down to those of us that share our DNA. So intergenerational blessing, to use a biblical term, I don't know what the psychological equivalent would be, but intergenerational blessing, what we pass down to those of us who share our DNA, we're loving them as if we're loving ourselves, because we're saying, this is how I wish I was loved.
Yeah, you're breaking that pattern. You're starting a new one. And that's different.
Yeah.
And I think you do that as the best you can. So like the first time that you mentioned what your therapist said, that part of me recoiled, like, how dare she like put on you the responsibility of like generations of trauma and like
right. And that's what it can sound like.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what so much of the Bible and like just good wisdom can sound like. Like an example comes to mind of like Philippians 4, don't be anxious about anything. You know, like, man, that's good advice. As soon as you turn that into a moral issue, that's a problem.
Right. As soon as you moralize it and say, this is what happens every time, all the time, for everyone.
Right. And if you are anxious, then you're doing something bad and you need to be punished.
Yeah.
Damn it, that's not what it says. Oh, God. This is not mean, it's worded in English as a command, and I think probably grammatically it might be worded in Greek as a command, but it's not supposed to be like a rule. It's supposed to be like, hey, it's supposed to be an encouragement. Like,
it's descriptive, not
stuff
prescriptive.
happens. Bad stuff will happen.
Yeah.
And try not to be anxious because it doesn't help, you know? Do your best.
Do your best. Just try. Just
Yeah,
try not to be anxious.
and it's God won't be mad at you if you are still anxious. You'll just feel anxious, and that sucks.
I think that this goes back to what you were talking about with grace. It changes the whole conversation. Because, like, if the idea is like be anxious about nothing, so if I'm anxious, I'm doing something wrong, you're not grounding it first in the idea of grace.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from my own experience with general anxiety disorder,
Mm-hmm.
I can't control my anxiety. I can't. It doesn't work. Medication helps. It doesn't fix
Mm-hmm.
it. Mindfulness helps. It doesn't fix it.
Sure.
But I can say there is a vast difference between me feeling the anxiety that comes from my disorder and me being anxious about the arrow in my leg.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the whole suffering. If we ground it in the idea of love, which is ultimately what grace is, then possibly I can trust that Jesus sits with me in my pain so that I don't have to suffer.
Yeah. I think that's the narrative of the entirety of Scripture. I think this isn't quite accurate, but I think if I were to try to redefine sin, I would, rather than wrongdoing, I would redefine it as suffering. And
Makes sense.
The remedy is not about punishment.
Right.
It's about presence. God is present with us in our suffering, and it makes things better.
Right.
We're not alone.
And it differentiates. It helps us look beyond our own suffering to someone else and saying, I'm not the only one with an arrow in my leg, but I can walk and this person can't. So how can I care for them?
Yeah, there's an element of gratitude in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
That, it's not like I'm better than them, so I should, make sure everyone sees it by helping them. It's like, I'm genuinely grateful that I have the ability to walk, which is something I'm going to say 100% of us overlook on most days.
It's true.
But being able to accept what isn't just about accepting the pain that is. It's about accepting the good it is and noticing it, right? So the fact that there's an arrow in my leg is something that I should strive to accept if I can. Also, the fact that I can walk when there isn't an arrow in my leg on a daily basis to get wherever I need to go is something that I can truly be grateful for. That is a good thing. But I normally don't think about it. So gratitude is incredible. And if I can be grateful for it, like there's all sorts of like writings and evidence to show like people who have suffered a loss of a child or something, somebody in their life, or just any major setback where there's a lot of pain involved. Like people will tend to like not talk about how their children are doing to someone who's lost a child. And it's not helpful. People know, like, oh, you're like weirdly avoiding talking about your children when we normally would
Right.
talk about your children. Like, and like, how dare you not value your children? You have them. Like, no, like being genuinely grateful is not the same thing as like rubbing it in. It's
No.
the assumption of like, of course I would have my children because I made different choices or I'm somehow better than you. That's the problem. But it's like
Yeah.
genuinely like my children are a gift and they might be taken at any moment, but I'm so grateful that they're here now. That's not just a gift to you, but that's a gift to everyone around you, including the bereaved parent.
It sounds like gratitude is the acceptance of truth.
Yeah. Just as much as accepting pain as truth prevents suffering, accepting gratitude as truth promotes resilience.
Mm.
Brene Brown is a name that probably a lot of people know.
Mm-hmm.
And her method of research, she researches shame and vulnerability, and resilience,
Mm-hmm.
and all sorts of really fun stuff to dig into. Mostly stated sarcastically when you're trying to apply it to your own life.
Yeah.
But um, her method of research requires that there are no outliers. She can't declare that a result of having identified the factor that contributes to whatever it is, whether it's resilience or shame or whatever, until she has an explanation that fits for 100% of her sample. And what she has said is that for people that the term that she uses is wholehearted, those who are courageous and resilient and vulnerable and don't get totally derailed by bad things happening or judgments coming their way, is the one thing that 100% of them have in common is a practice of gratitude.
So if we could see the truth, accept the truth, file the truth where it belongs. I've got an arrow in my leg and I've got my children. I've got an arrow in my leg and I've got good friends. Holding those two things in tandem with each other, knowing that they don't cancel each other out. But it helps us.
Both true.
And if they're both true, then we always have something to give the other people that are around us. Okay, let me back up. We're all in flux as beings, right? Okay. So if we're all in flux as beings and are being ourselves, that action, and we accept the truth, we always have something to give the other people that are being around us.
Yeah. We have something to offer because we're valuable. And recognizing the things that are in and around us as good, it helps us do that. The things are there whether we recognize it or not, but we don't know what to do with it until we recognize it.
Okay, so that's some shit right there. the things in us are good whether we recognize it or not. Okay, so let me ask this. In light of that statement, that the things that are good in us are good whether we recognize them or not. This is going to seem like a non sequitur, but I still want you to answer. In light of that statement, what is the gospel?
Focused through that statement. Gospel of Christ, as the divine image within us is present, regardless of the problematic strategies of the flesh that try to preserve life at all costs. The divine image and relationship with others who also have the divine image is present regardless of the cultural and societal patterns that promote injustice and selfishness and harm. That the spirit of love is with us and for us, regardless of whether we feel connected and can see it and feel it or not. And letting go of the control over any of that can help us see that. And we have our big brother Jesus, who did that and got it written down in the Bible to show us the way.
I like that interpretation of the gospel, that the divine image is present in us whether we accept it or not, and the divine image is present in others whether they accept it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus showed us the way as the divine image. Wow, that's so good. Wow. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fantastic conversation.
It's been a lot of fun.
It was a great therapy session for me, so thanks.
It wasn't what I was trying to do, but you're welcome.
No, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Yeah, you're going to have to come back and we're going to have to pick this up again because that's just good. That's good grace. It's a gospel of grace right there. It really is. So thank you very much. You have a great rest of your evening, okay?
Yeah, you too, Aaron.
All right, thanks.